Where's DNA? Everyone stay up there.
You know, you could probably get some VIP seats. You could probably get some good money for them.
Oops, Lacey.
Okay, we're good.
There you go.
Sorry about that, everyone. We were trying to fix... I guess there were some audio bugs last time. You couldn't hear some of the videos, something like that.
Did anyone else see that?
And some other
Ninja
problems
Turtle?
popped up.
There's a Ninja Turtle event.
Kyle, you streaming?
Hop in.
No, not for this. I figure it's going to be gory and graphic, and I don't want to risk it.
We're streaming if you want to host.
Ooh, yeah, definitely.
That way you can't be held responsible for it.
Okay, let's just...
Exactly.
DNA, maybe let me know when the room's about as full as it was. Get started.
Okay, are we updated?
Give it about a minute, yeah.
Minute, yeah, okay.
Sure, we're streaming right now.
Hi, Medai, all clean?
So maybe a good time while I'm here to recap the things that we've looked at. So we are now on lecture 4. The first lecture, we looked at what you need to have a murder legally, actus reus, mens rea. We looked at the Monotone case, whether someone is legally considered sane or insane is different than whether they are mentally ill, or medical versus legal concepts. We have... we looked at double murders, triple murders, 4 more, then we're into mass murders, 4 more victims but no fatalities with a gun, that's mass shooting, 2 murders in separate events, no return to routine, that's a spree killing, 2 in separate events, 2 or more in separate events with a return to routine, that's serial murder. That's going to be pretty much the focus of what we look at from now on, because that's where all the sexy stuff is. We looked at instrumental violence, that's goal-oriented, premeditated violence versus reactive violence, hot-blooded, you blow up in the moment violence. And that was just the first lecture. Then the second lecture, we looked at psychopathy, how psychopaths interact, their traits, how they're more capable of instrumental type violence as well as reactive. And we also looked at how psychotic people, when they do commit acts of violence, how they're motivated differently and how that plays out. And then last lecture, we looked at all these different types of motives that people have for murder. I think I made a pretty good argument that there is no such thing as a senseless crime, and that we went through all the various motives and how they can often intermingle: convenience, money, identity, jealousy, revenge, sex of all various kinds. We had the killer rapist in David Carpenter. We had the paraphilic killer in Albert Fish. We looked at how ideologies, whether they be religious or secular, like political, can play roles in that, loyalty to organization. So that's everything we've covered so far, but we haven't really gotten into investigation and the ways that criminals actually pull off their crimes and that we investigate them. And that's what I'm going to look at with you today. This is one of my favorite subjects. And I've given slightly more complicated talks on this topic to police. We're going to look at MO and signature, modus operandi and signature. So without further ado, I think it's probably about go time.
Let's do it.
Okay, so you'll often hear MO in a cop show. They'll say, what's the killer's MO? But it's probably rare that you hear the term signature. And there's a substantial difference. The thing about MO is it's the mode of operation. How did the criminal go about operating in this crime? So it's very much the how. How did they do the crime? So if the crime is a murder, well, how did they go about facilitating this murder? I mean, did they attack someone on the street, inside their house? They picked them up in a car? What tactics did they use on them? It's really the method. is not what gratifies them. It's not the motive. That's signature. Signature goes to motive. It's the why. Well, why did they do it in the first place? What were they looking to get out of the murder? So if you start by thinking of these two things as two parts of the way a crime is committed, and understand that the signature is the why, it's the whole reason you're doing it in the first place, and MO is just the how. You know, how did I decide to go about it that would be easiest for me to get access to a victim, get away? You can understand that the MO can be quite dynamic, meaning that it doesn't really matter. Maybe I can try it this way this time, and if it didn't work out the way I planned it, I'll just switch it up next time. But because it's not addressing the motive, that's the signature. That's the part that gratifies the offender. The signature, unlike the MO, is relatively static. It can change a little bit, but if the motive to rob a bank is to get money, you can bet that every time they're robbing that bank, barring some X factor that prevents them, they're taking money with them. And if they can't take money, they might take jewelry or money from the clients in the bank. But it's relatively the same thing. And that's fairly obvious. But when we look at sex crimes or crimes that are pretty much driven by power or violence, you'll see this signature component. That's a basic introduction. I think we're going to start out just by looking at MO, and signature will come a bit later. I will warn you that today's lecture is going to be the most gruesome, and there will be some crime scene photos, but I'll give you a heads up on that. This is the Blitz attack, MO.
I was sitting at the inside of the arch of the Dakota building, and it was dark. It was windy. Jose, the doorman, was out along the sidewalk. And here's another odd thing that happened. I was at an angle where I could see Central Park West and 72nd, and I see this limousine pull up. And as you know, there's probably hundreds of limousines that turn up Central Park West in the evening. But I knew that was his. And I said, this is it. And I stood up. The limousine pulled up. The door opened. The rear left door opened. Yoko got out. John was far behind, say 20 feet, when he got out. I nodded to Yoko when she walked by me.
She nod back?
No, she didn't. And I don't mean to be so clinical about this, but I've told it a number of times. I hope you understand. John came out, and he looked at me, and I think he recognized, here's the fella that I signed the album earlier. And he walked past me. I took 5 steps toward the street, turned, withdrew my Charter Arms 38, and fired 5 shots into his back.
All in his back?
All in his back.
Never saw it coming?
He never saw anything coming, Larry. It was a very quick, it was a rough thing.
What, had you shot that weapon before?
That weapon, no. I didn't even know if the bullets were going to work. And when they worked, I remember thinking, they're working, they're working. I was worried that the plane in the baggage compartment, the humidity had ruined them. And I remember thinking, they're working.
What did Yoko do?
She, naturally, and I can't blame her, she dashed around the stair area. I don't know if it's still there at the Dakota today, but she just, you know, ran for cover, which is what anyone would do. Mm-hmm. John, according to what I've been told, stumbled up the stairs, and then I saw her come back around and then go up to the stairs, and then she cradled his body.
Okay, so let's think about this attack here. As I said, hope you caught some of it. This is a classic blitz attack. It's pretty basic. He waits for the celebrity to come back to his house. He waits for the celebrity to walk by him, then he just pulls out a gun and shoots him in the back. There's no trickery. It's not sophisticated. It's just like the rapist who jumps out of the bushes and clobbers his victim. It's like you're walking down the street and suddenly that guy jumps out of the alley with a knife. It is that is pretty much a Blitz MO. Now, could Chapman have gone about it another way? Well, the point was to kill John Lennon, and he didn't really seem particularly concerned with getting away with it. In fact, I would argue that he wanted to be known as the guy that killed John Lennon. So that makes sense as to why he chose that attack. But he could have done it a different way. Earlier in the night, Lennon had stopped to sign a copy of his latest album for Chapman. Now Chapman has engaged Lennon. He's talking to him. And maybe he could have tricked Lennon in some way. Likely not, because it's John Lennon. But if it's somebody else, maybe he could have tricked John Lennon for going to coffee with him, just as an example, and could have pulled off the crime in a much different way. But because his goal really was only, I just need to kill John Lennon, he chooses this very unsophisticated blitz attack. But he doesn't have to, because the point is to kill. He can use any mode of operation, any MO to do it. He just happened to choose blitz. Now we're going to hear from a serial killer. Okay, this is Ed Kemper. You're going to recognize this guy from Mindhunter. And he's going to talk about getting people into his car. And unlike Chapman, Ed wants to get away with the crime because he enjoys it. He kills for feelings of power, feelings of sexual gratification. And so to kill him the way that Chapman did would first of all, it wouldn't satisfy him because these are sex crimes. He needs to take time with the victim. He was a necrophile. He liked to mutilate the bodies. So this is more of an example of what we would call a con or ruse approach. And he talks about how he actually practiced it.
I'd gotten practice at that. All that driving around, it wasn't rehearsing. I made a game out of driving around, picking people up. And later on, I discerned that some people wouldn't get in my car because of the situation. I'm a young man by myself. It's unsafe. So I thought, well, gee, that kind of put me off. I'm not doing anything to anybody, so I want to see if I can change that situation where they'll want to get in and I can take them where they're going. Because I know I'm not going to do anything. And I got to where I could diffuse that situation. It's how you're looking. If you look, oh boy, all right, you start cranking the car over there. They're not going to get in your car because they can see you from half a block away drooling. But if you look at your watch and say, geez, I don't know if I have enough time, and you're kind of in the mirror and looking around, and you pull over, this guy's just a businessman going somewhere, and get in his car, we'll go where we're going. And it's little games I played so they'd get in the car. And then we chatted, and I talked about things, and I found out where their orientations were, and their what they used to judge and who could get in and who they could get in with and who they couldn't, right? In that sense, it's been interpreted as what do you call it, rehearsing. It's not true. It's like playing chess and then turning it into something ugly. I played chess casually. I played chess more and more thoroughly till I got very good at it, which was picking up people to where I could make you a bet. I can pick up those two ladies. And they'd say, oh man, you're crazy. Those are two very crafty young ladies who won't get in a car with a young man by himself, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd win the bet because I knew how to diffuse the situation. Even if they asked, where are you headed, right? And they had a sign saying where they're going, but they'd ask, or even if they didn't, they'd say, where are you headed? And I had ways of developing it to where they wouldn't get suspicious. But I didn't mean I was going to kill them. It meant I was playing a game. And then later, when I started killing people, I used that against them.
There you go. Like, think of all the thought that goes into that, into just the perfect way to get anybody into their car, even in this situation where they know there's a serial killer at large who's killing hitchhikers. Well, he's working on it. If I look at my watch, I make it look like I don't really want to pick them up, but if I kind of have to. So this is a classic con or ruse. We're now going to look at the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, who killed 10 people in the Wichita area of Kansas between 1974 and 1991. And unlike Kemper, he was a home invader. So his MO was to go into the homes of his victims. So let's see how some of the tricks that he used to gain access to those homes.
Vicky was another potential victim. I went through those different phases, locked in on her, as I would call it, and decided that I would try that date. I used a ruse as a telephone repairman to get in their house. Drove there in my own personal car around lunchtime, during lunch hour. Anyway, I walked from my car as a telephone repairman. As I walked there, I donned the telephone helmet. I had a briefcase. Went to one other address just to kind of size up the house. I'd walked by it a couple times, but I wanted to check it a little bit more. As I approached it, I could hear a piano sound. And went to this other door, knocked on them, and told them that we were recently working on telephone repairs in the area. And went to her and knocked on the door and asked her if I could come check her telephone lines inside.
Did she allow you in?
Yes, she did.
What happened then?
Went over and found out where the telephone was, simulated that I was checking the telephone. I had a make-believe instrument, and after she was looking away, I drew a pistol at her and asked her if she'd go back to the bedroom with me.
Okay, and so that's the key with these cons or ruses, is that at some point you have to expose yourself, meaning your real agenda. So you can trick someone into getting into the car. You can ride with them for hours. You can go into someone's house and pretend to be a telephone repairman. But at some point, you have to spring the trap. The blitz just ignores the trickery part and goes right to springing the trap. So these are both ways. These are both MO. They're the way that the crime is committed. They're the how. They're not necessarily the why. And is it possible that Ed Kemper could have switched and used Dennis Rader's technique? He certainly could have. Why not? He just would have wanted to kill people in their own homes, wanted to try that out. And Rader could have tried it out on hitchhikers. Both, if they were successful, would have been able to go on to do the sex acts that gratified them, the signature. But that's not what we're talking about at the moment. We're talking about MO. And this... I'd advise you to be very careful about this, because this whole I'm from the phone company, I've got to check your phone, this is not a one-time thing. I've seen this more times than I can count. For instance, the famous Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo. He was, before he was the Boston Strangler, he was the Measuring Man. The Measuring Man was a sex offender. And what he would do is he'd go to women's homes and he'd knock on the door. And if he saw a woman that he found attractive, he'd say, "Hi, I'm from a modeling agency and we're looking for talent." He says, you look like you have a good figure. Do you mind if I come in and take your measurements? So he's playing to the vanity, and flattering the victim. Oh yes, I'd love to be a model. I've always been told I have a good figure. I'm good looking. And then he'd come into the apartment and he would take out his tape measure and he would measure their bust and their waist and their hips. And as he was doing this, he would cop a feel. He would go a little too far, and well, a lot too far. But the idea is that a lot of these women, though they felt uncomfortable, didn't even report him at the time, because they just thought, well, I'm going to get a job as a model. It'll all work out. It wasn't until later when they found out that there was no guy working for a modeling company. It was just a sex offender using a con on them to cop a feel, that they became very angry. But later, and this is what's important, he would use a similar, like a variation on this con, this trick, to gain access to the apartments of the women he murdered as the Boston Strangler. Now, I believe he would often, once again, pose as a maintenance person, but he was a very charming guy and could talk his way past the door. So generally, I would say, do not let, especially if you're a female alone at home, don't let any guy that knocks on your door purporting to be from whatever company, even if they're in a uniform, even if they show you a card, do not let that guy into your apartment, because countless people have died that way. And if they're a professional, they'll understand. And you should be able to contact their boss or phone someone before you allow them entry. So, you close the door, say, I'm just going to check out on you, and then we'll see. And then there is, I tend to divide things into blitz and cons. Some people will say there's a surprise, but I think that is just, it's not really necessary to learn about that. But sometimes a blitz attack can turn into a con. So it starts with pulling a gun in someone's face or attacking them, but then it's followed up with a trick. Oh, I'm just going to do this. So let's go back to Dennis Rader, part of his MO, where he starts with a blitz and then moves to a con. The end result is still the same.
That particular day I had some commitments. I left those, went to one place, changed my clothes, went to another place, parked my car, finally made arrangements on my hip kit, my clothes, and then walked to that residence. After spending some time at that residence, it was very cold at night. Had reservations about going in. I had cased the place before, and I really couldn't figure out how to get in, and she was in the house, so I finally just selected a concrete block and threw it through the plate glass window on the east and came on in.
All right, so you used a concrete block to break the window?
Mm-hmm. Plate glass window, patio door. Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
Noise. I just went in. She came out of the bedroom and thought that a car had hit her house, and I told her that I used the roofs of being wanted.
Now he switches.
On the run, I need food, car, warm up, and I asked her, handcuffed her, and kind of talked to her, told her that I would like to get some food, get her keys, her car, and kind of rest assured, talked with her a little bit and calmed her down a little bit. And then eventually I checked, I think she was still handcuffed. I went back and checked out where the car was, simulated getting some food, odds and ends in the house that I was leaving. Then went back and removed her handcuffs and then tied her up. And then eventually strangled her.
Okay, so you can see two examples by the same offender there where he's used variations to get access to his victim. So the first time he talked, he went to the door and he said that he worked for the telephone company. He used a con to get into the house. And that time there, he just gets frustrated trying to get in. So he just smashes the window, goes in, confronts the victim, and then lies to them. Says, I'm just a robber. I'm desperate. I want some food and your car keys. Just let me handcuff you. So his MO is changing. It's kind of the same, but it can change drastically because this isn't the part that gratifies him. The part that gratified Dennis Rader was tying women up. He had a fetish for ropes. He had a paraphilia where he liked seeing women in bondage called vincelania. And that is what got him off, setting up that scene. That's the signature. The MO he uses can change. It doesn't matter. And that's why linking crimes only by MO can be a very dangerous thing. Because you can think, well, this is a different offender. Look, he entered the house a different way. This guy talked his way past the door. This guy broke the glass. It mustn't be the same guy. Well, it was, as you could see. So MO is not good enough. It can be very dynamic. Signature is what we should focus on. And when we, another part of MO, just in passing, you might have remembered in previous lectures, we talked about the case of Jeffrey McDonald, who murdered his family and then staged it to look like a Manson family crime. He likely wasn't motivated to do this. It didn't fill some intrinsic need. It was part of him getting away with a crime. So staging a crime almost all of the time is part of MO. But now let's move on to signature for a little bit. Let's look at it in contrast. Meet Charles Albright, the Dallas Ripper. In 1990, Charles Albright killed 3 sex workers in different locations on different occasions. So what does that make him? A serial killer. And he shot them. The police would show up. They would find a dead sex worker lying on, in some alleyway or on the street. And they think it was rather routine until they took it back to the medical examiner. The medical examiner would observe the body and notice that in each case, the sex worker's eyes had been cut out and were missing. They had been surgically removed with an X-Acto knife. And that's because Charles Albright had a fetish for eyeballs, and we call that oculophilia. So he could have he could have done the crime anyway. He didn't need to use a gun. He might have strangled one. He might have picked one up in his car and drove them out to the outskirts of town. He might have gone into their home. But so that's the MO. But the signature, the taking of the eyeballs and using that to sexually gratify himself, that's the why. That's the motive. That's the signature. And it's all three cases. And no matter how the pattern of the crimes changed, if he would have kept going without being caught, those or something to do with eyeballs would have always been a component of it. So that's why signature is so much better in linking crimes than MO. Not that all signatures are sexual. Remember last time we talked about the Zodiac killer and how he walked out at Lake Berryessa dressed in this strange costume? I mean, you could say, well, it's MO, he wants to disguise himself, but you don't need to wear an executioner's hood to disguise yourself. You don't need a supervillain type symbol on your chest. You don't need to write on your victims' cars the dates of all the murders you've committed. How does that help you kill them? It doesn't. This is a type of signature behavior that is not sexual, but it's got more to do with his identity. I'm not this loser. Okay, I'm not this guy who can't hold down a job or underachieves or can't meet women or I'm a nobody. Nobody pays attention to me. No, I'm the Zodiac killer. I'm like Magneto. Here's my symbol. See? So it's not necessary to commit the murders, but it's what gratifies him. It's what fulfills him. It is his signature. Zodiac wrote letters. Here's another example. This isn't a Zodiac letter. This is the Son of Sam, 1976 to 77. Kills about 6 people in different incidents in New York City in various boroughs, wounds about 6 or 7 more. Just walks up to people's cars and shoots into them, mainly trying to kill women, but also kills a few men. And he writes these really strange letters to the chief of police and to the newspaper. Now, does he get off sexually doing it? There's no evidence that in this case he does, but it's still a signature behavior. He needs to communicate. He needs to express his identity. I am the Son of Sam. Once again, I am not just this loser who sits in his apartment all the time and works in a mail room and has no self-esteem and no ability to meet friends. No, I'm terrorizing the city. I've even given myself a name. Check out my cool symbol at the bottom. This is all signature behavior. So it can be about sexuality or it can be about identity. And I've studied both. I focused the first part of my academic career in getting all the sexual stuff right. And then for the latter part of my academic career, I wanted to understand these, what I call identity signatures. So why is this important? I've talked about linking crimes, and this is the art of linkage analysis. There's kind of like 5 broad ways that we can link crimes. The most important, obviously, is physical evidence. So look, if the DNA from crime scene A matches the DNA from crime scene B, or the fibers or footprints or whatever to a lesser extent, that's pretty good. You know, the DNA is almost perfect. So that's probably the best way that we link crimes, but we don't always have that evidence, or that evidence is lost or degraded. Another way is victimology, right? We look at the victims. Do they share things in common? What about the biological sex, their gender, their racial background, their what they were doing at the time, the risk they're in, what profession do they do, little things about the way they look. So that's one way. MO is one of the ways, but as I said, it's not entirely reliable, and neither is, victimology, because there are some offenders who will switch between various types of victims. When we talked about psychopathy, we talked about equal opportunity victimization. There are some people, they don't care. They'll prey upon anyone. So even the victimology and that's not as reliable. And the MO, we've seen there, it isn't. Signature is your most reliable. It's the why. It's the weird part. It's the part that seems unnecessary. It's the thing in the movie Seven where it's like, well, why did you make that guy eat himself to death and write gluttony on the wall? They didn't need to do that to kill him. You could have just shot him. Well, it's part of the motive. So signature is really what you focus on first, you have the most importance to. But then there's also, of course, the geographic features, right? If you've got a lot of murders happening in the same geographic proximity, especially if it's a place that frequently doesn't have murders or doesn't have murders of this sort, or is particularly small, then that comes into play. And there's actually a software system called geographic profiling that is used to link these cases. So that's the way that we link cases. But as I said to you, it's really the signature part that is the most important. And that's what I tend to focus on during my investigations. Probably most useful in really aberrant homicides, but it pops up a lot. And you can even say that the absence of signature is a type of signature in itself. And it's really important for this reason to keep details of the crime out of the public, away from the public. You have to withhold certain information. We call this holdback info. And this can be very frustrating if you're like me and there's a series of unsolved murders and you're reading about it in the newspaper and you go, damn, I need to know everything about it. You know, I'd like to be able to solve this in my own. Okay, that's weird. Okay, so I'll just start that again. So it's very important to keep information away from the newspapers. Certain key parts of information, particularly related to signature, cannot be revealed to the public. And this can be frustrating as a member of the public because you want to know everything that happened in the crime. You want to play amateur sleuth. You want to know, are these related? Why aren't you giving out all the info? Why are the police holding their cards so close to their chest? Well, there is actually a good reason. It's that if you release all the info, as what was happened in the case of the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, then you get this copycat effect. So they made the mistake rather early on in the Boston Stranglings of describing the intricate way that the Boston Strangler tied his ligatures. I think they even mentioned that he tied a bow. Well, they just revealed his signature to the public. So now, if I want to kill my wife or girlfriend or just any woman I don't like, or I just want to, I'm not the Boston Strangler, but I want to commit a sexual homicide and get away with it. I know now that if I tie the rope like this and leave a bow, they're going to think it's the Boston Strangler. It allows me to stage the crime scene. So I can take his signature and make it a part of my MO to get away with the crime. I saw this in a case. This was one of the first cold cases I ever worked. This is in London, Ontario, Canada. That's Jacqueline Dunleavy. I think she was about 15 years old when she was murdered in January of 1969. This is Frankie Jensen. He was 9 years old when he was murdered in February of 1969. They both lived in the same type of area. Obviously, both very different types of victims, but small city and a month apart in a place where you don't have many sexual homicides, at least not at that time, both sexual homicides, it would be really important, like, to hold back that information. And they didn't. Like, take a look at this. So this is right after the Jacqueline Dunleavy slaying, but it's before the Frankie Jensen murder. And you won't be able to read this, but trust me, it's up there. I'll let on the rope later if you don't believe me, but I'm sure you do. It says in this article that a wad of tissue paper was found stuffed in Jackie Dunleavy's mouth. Well, later, a month later, when Frankie Jensen is found floating in the river, guess what's in his mouth? A wad of tissue paper. So people start going, aha, it's the same killer. This guy's the tissue slayer. They even coin a name for him, the tissue slayer. But you know what? Let me let you in on a little secret. The newspaper got it wrong. There was never a wad of tissue in Jackie Dunleavy's mouth. It was a packet of tissues that had been placed in her mouth. Now, if that was your signature, to place a packet of tissues in her mouth, then you would see a packet of tissue in Frankie Jensen's mouth too. But I argue, and these cases are still unsolved, actually, read this article and said, oh, okay, well, now if I take this wad of tissue and I put it in his mouth, they're going to think it's the same guy that did Jackie English. And that's going to confuse them jurisdictionally and in all different ways. So this holdback information is really crucial when concerning signature.
I manually strangled her when she started to scream.
So you used your hands?
Yes, sir.
And you strangled.
Okay, so I just realized what I want to talk about next. There is one of the signatures that we commonly see is posing. Someone will pose a body. But it's not always for the same reason. Sometimes people pose a body for sexual reasons, and at other times they pose a body for the identity reasons to convey a message. So it's the same thing that I argued before. There's sexually based posing, and there's posing to send a message about who you are and what you think about the victim. I'm going to give you two examples of sexually based posing. It's done purely for the gratification of the offender. BTK Dennis Rader again. Notice that the victim is dead when he does this.
No, I manually strangled her when she started to scream.
So you used your hands?
Yes, sir.
And you strangled her? Did she die?
Yes.
All right, what did you do then?
After that, since I was in the sexual fantasy, I went ahead and stripped her, and probably went ahead and I'm not sure if I tied her up at that point.
Tying up a corpse?
Anyway, she was nude. I put her on a blanket, went through her purse, some personal items in the house, figured out how I was going to get her out of there. Eventually moved her to the trunk of the car. Took the car over to Christ Lutheran Church. This is with the older church, and took some pictures of her.
All right, you took some photographs. What kind of camera did you use?
Poor
Did you keep those photographs?
Yes, the police probably have them.
All right, what happened then?
That was it. She went through. I tied it. She was already dead, so I took pictures of her in different forms of bondage, and that's probably what got me in trouble was the bondage thing. So anyway, that's probably the main thing. But anyway, after that, I moved her back out to the car.
So right there, that in itself is interesting. She's dead. You don't need to tie up a corpse. Why is he doing this? Because, well, it's kind of necrophilic, but his main thing is that he gets off on tying up women, and so he strangles her, but he's not done yet. It doesn't matter that it's not MO. He doesn't need to keep her restrained because the corpse is going to jump up and run away. She's dead. No, it's sexual. It's posing as a sexual signature, and it's not just him. I'm going to give you another example here. The next guy we're going to look at is Dennis Nilsen, who killed. Dennis Nilsen was gay. He lived in London, England, and he killed 12 young men, and he did so inside his apartment, and he would keep them under the floorboards or in the closet, and he would take them out and sometimes masturbate over them. But let's listen to the way he talks about dressing them to make them seem more attractive.
Carry him in, make him appear even better. I had some sort of wire fronts in cellophane in a vest. I put that on him because it enhanced his appearance in some way.
Yeah, so he would put what he calls Y front vests on the corpses of his victims, and he would wrap them in like saran wrap. And why this made them more attractive to him, who knows? But he says it right there. That's what I did. You know, it enhanced the way they looked to me. So it's posing the bodies, sexual, private, personal, as opposed to these offenders here. These are all British offenders. Something about British serial killers lends themselves to posing bodies to communicate messages in a really interesting way. So let me tell you quickly about some of them. This is Stephen Farrow. Stephen Farrow killed a priest, or a vicar, I should say, more accurately. And he found out, I suppose, that this man was a closeted homosexual. So what he did is he went through all of his belongings and he found gay pornography magazines, and he spread it out on the priest's body. And he took party poppers and he surrounded the priest's body with party poppers and all of these accessories to kind of say, look, you pretend to be a man of God, you pretend to be this pure person, but really you're, and this is his thinking, not mine, you're a pervert. And this is what this symbolizes, and I'm placing it over you. You know, you're not what you pretend to be. And so he's humiliating him, but he's revealing a stigmatized aspect of this reverend's character. Meet one of the scariest women probably in existence. This is Joanna Dennehy here. Joanna Dennehy, once again, a British, more of like a spree killer actually, but on the verge of spree and serial. And she tricked her landlord and lover, Kevin Lee, into dressing in a black sequin dress in some kind of sex game. And once he was in this black sequin dress, she stabbed him to death, and with the help of some male accomplices, took him out to the countryside, dumped him in a ditch. So they found his body in a black sequin dress, face down with his anus exposed. I mean, this is emasculating. This degrades him. In death, he's found in a dress and sexualized. And Joanna Dennehy was often referred to as the man woman, and she acted very masculine. So it was almost like she was communicating that she was subverting these gender roles and the posing. And perhaps most interesting here is Colin Ireland. Colin Ireland preyed on gay men in London in 1993. His goal was to become a serial killer. He would actually phone the newspapers and state that. And Colin Ireland, two of Colin Ireland's victims, he would take condoms and stuff them into their nose and into their mouths. And on the first victim, Peter Walker, he covered him with a blanket, and he placed two teddy bears in a 69 sexual position on top of the cover. It's almost as if to say, you know, like, look how perverted these homosexuals are. Like, but it's also like you could read more into it too. You could say maybe he equates them with pedophilia, which is something that came out during his interviews, and that by taking teddy bears, it's like a symbol of innocence and putting them into sex acts. His fourth victim, Andrew Collier, he does pretty much the same thing to, except he strangles Andrew Collier's cat. He puts Andrew Collier's cat's mouth on the victim's penis, and then he puts a condom on the end of the cat's tail and puts that tail into the victim's mouth. So it's pretty much the same thing. These aren't sexually motivated, although interestingly, they all draw upon sexual themes of sexual identity, to reveal something about the victim or to stigmatize or humiliate them. But they're not sexually gratifying to the offender. They're sending a message. I killed this person in this way because this is what they are and this is what I think about them. And you know what? That tells you about me. So this is identity type posing. Ted Bundy, okay, is a great example of how much a guy's MO can change over the course of his killing career. Bundy was at the pinnacle of organized MO at a period of time, and then completely devolved into something like out of a slasher movie. So let's start with his first known victim. Actually, before this victim, in January 1974, January the 4th, he breaks into the basement apartment of Karen Sparks in Washington State. He bludgeons her in her sleep, and he sexually assaults her with a speculum. She has terrible lasting injuries, but she survives. February 1st, less than a month later, he goes after poor Linda Healy here. Once again, he goes into the basement room of her home. She's in bed. She's sleeping. He bludgeons her, but unlike Karen Sparks, he then takes her body, slings it over his shoulder, carries it out to his car, and drives her out into the mountains. We're not sure whether she was dead or alive at the time. Maybe she was unconscious. Who knows what he did to her out there? Bundy didn't talk much about that. But you can see right there, he starts with this MO of breaking in, bludgeoning, and taking control. And by the first known homicide victim, Healy, he's taking her out to the woods. Now, it's not particularly sophisticated, but there are multiple crime scenes. He then goes on to commit a number of other abductions resulting in murders on various college and university campuses in Seattle. And I'll give you one example here, which represents actually sort of the, we'll call it the apex of Bundy's killing career in Washington, when he was really, really doing the best at it. And that is the case of Georgianne Hawkins. There were others before Hawkins and there were others after, but this case illustrates Bundy using his most elaborate and, let's say, arguably best, most sophisticated MO. It's June 11th, same year as the previous two crimes, but by June 11th he's refined it, and he goes to the University of Washington, where Hawkins is a student, and he seems to encounter her in an alleyway between her boyfriend's home and her dormitory. And he approaches her on crutches with his leg in a cast, and he's trying to carry a briefcase, and he keeps fumbling it and dropping it. So he's not asking her for help, but yeah, I mean, she's probably a nice lady. She's grown up to help people out who are in trouble. Like, here I am walking down the street. There's this poor guy in crutches. He's got his leg in a cast, and he keeps fumbling this briefcase. I mean, I've got to help him out. And so that's what she does, and he accepts. He says, yeah, can you just help me carry my briefcase to the car? Probably starts spinning some story about how he broke his leg. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. They get to the car. Maybe he uses the crutch. Maybe he's hidden a tire iron behind the wheel. But as soon as they're by his Volkswagen Bug, he knocks her unconscious. He drops the disguise, and he piles her into the back seat, drives her out into the wilds, and does whatever Bundy does with her. Like I said, he never really tells us. That's something that we can get into maybe a few lectures down. But as you can see, this has become now a very sophisticated. He's gone from the Blitz to a very sophisticated con, but he's trying it on a few people, and it's not always working. And so now there starts to be witnesses that are saying, yeah, when these women are going missing, we see this guy on campus, and he's walking around, and he's, with crutches, and he keeps dropping his briefcase, or he's got his arm in a sling, and he's asking to help carry books to his car. So it's a good MO, but it makes him visible. And at some point, I think that he starts to get a little bored with doing it this way, because he gets more brazen. And I'm talking about by July the 14th. That's Denise Naslund on the left and Janice Ott. This is in broad daylight. So far, Bundy's been operating at night. Now, on July 14th at Lake Sammamish State Park, there's thousands of people out. It's a sunny day. People are having hot dogs. They're swimming. They're sunbathing. And Bundy goes out there with his left arm in a sling, and he's wearing a white tennis outfit. And he seems to be putting on an accent. Some say it was like a soft British, or I've even heard Canadian accent, which don't sound the same to me. But this was how witnesses described it. And he would approach women, and with his arm in this sling, in front of thousands of people, right? Not that they're all paying attention to him, but the point is it's in a big crowd. And he's saying, I need help getting this sailboat up to my aunt and uncle's house. I just can't get it attached to the car. Well, of course, most of the women that he says this to, they think, well, why are you asking me? Like, look at all these buff guys around. Like, you're asking me to do it? No, I'm not going to do that. One of them actually says, okay, I'll help you. She goes to the car and notices that there isn't a sailboat. And the minute she sees that, she gets the creeps and runs away. 2 people fall for it. Jana saw it first. She walks away and disappears from her group of friends. And then hours later, Denise Naslund, same day. They believe that he took them to a abandoned cabin and raped and killed one of them in front of the other to increase the terror. And he obviously killed both of them because they found their remains in the same place as Georgianne Hawkins on September the 6th. By that time, Bundy had left the state. But right here you go, okay, well, it's a double event. He's got 2. He's more successful, but he isn't. Now he's starting to be an idiot. He's being seen by thousands of people. It's in broad daylight. You know what name he's using? He's going up to people and he's introducing himself as Ted. And they actually say, the police, they go, well, there's one thing we know. His name isn't Ted, right? Because why would you do that? But people are seeing his face. They've got this guy called Ted. And it gets to the point where his own girlfriend actually reports him for this. And this is, remember we talked about psychopathy and the way that they feel empty inside and they need to always seek sensation. I think with Bundy at this point, it's that successful procuring these victims using the Georgianne Hawkins technique at night, that it's not enough. He starts to get bored of it and he wants to up the ante. So he's going to try something a little bit more daring. So we can see how the psychopathic personality colors and sabotages the crimes. And Bundy was a consummate psychopath. He scored very high on the checklist. He eventually gets caught, of course, doing this sort of behavior. He's caught in Utah, I believe it is, either Utah or Colorado, and he's imprisoned and awaiting trial. He escapes, and then he's caught again, and he goes back awaiting trial, imprisoned, escapes, and then he shows up. Finally, he's a fugitive. I think he made the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And it's not until January 15th, 1978, that Bundy appears again at Florida State University. He goes into a sorority house, and he's got a club with him. And he goes from room to room, bashing women over the head, biting them, sexually assaulting them. He doesn't take them from their rooms. He doesn't get them in a car. He's just like a monster in a slasher movie now, just on a rampage. And he kills Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and seriously hurt several others. Think of how much his MO changed over that series. You can see with those beginning crimes, he's going into the basement apartments, he's clubbing them, and he's taking them out into the wild. But then he realizes, well, that's probably dangerous. I'm leaving more forensic evidence. So I'm going to go and find them on campus. There's lots of pretty girls on campus to pick from. And then he's using props, the crutch. He's pretending to be hurt. And that's working well. But then the MO changes because, as I argued, I think that he's not getting the same thrill out of it. And that's when he starts to get sloppy with the Lake Sammamish abductions of Nat and Osland. And by the time that he's on the FBI's most wanted list and missing, he doesn't have anything to lose anymore. His MO switches up to just like, I'm going to get in there, I'm going to get as much violence out against women, as much sexual aggression as I can as possible, and I'm going to get out of there. So his MO changes, but there's always these sexual attacks on women that seem to involve biting, rape, foreign object penetration. And the same can be said of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe in the UK. He is always mutilating his victims. He's always cutting them open, hence the term Ripper. But his MO changes. Sometimes he'll just see someone he thinks is a sex worker walking down the street, just goes up to them, hits them over the head with a hammer. One time I think he put a brick in a sock and did it. Well, what's that? That's a blitz attack. You're just seeing someone and you're saying, you look like the kind of person I want to target. bang, surprise, and then he stabs them and cuts them open. Other times he would pick up sex workers in his car and drive them to another place and then spring the trap there. So he's using blitzes on some occasions. He's using cons on some occasions. His victims, especially with the blitzes, when he's using the blitzes, sometimes he attacks women that aren't sex workers. And sadly, this is when public sympathy turns towards this case. Like, we've got to get this guy off the street. Look, he's not just killing sex workers anymore, right? That old story. But the point is, in both cases, whether it's Bundy in the US, Sutcliffe in the UK, the MO is changing, but the behavior, the signature behavior, is always the same. There are actually computerized systems for to link crimes automatically. I don't think that they're great. There's a lot of problems with them. A lot of the times the police aren't properly trained on how to fill them out, how to administer them. But in the United States, the nationwide program is the Violent Crime Apprehension Program, known as VICAP. There is HITS. My good friend Detective Claude Steiger runs that out of the Washington State Attorney General's office. Homicide Investigation Tracking System. In Canada, we have VICLASS. And in the States, and in the United Kingdom, you have HOMES 2, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. I think they just wanted it to be named after Sherlock Holmes and then made up the words to sort of fit that. But what you do with these systems, if you have a violent attack or a homicide, you enter in the characteristics of the victim, you enter the MO components, and you enter in the better ones, you code the signature behavior right. And then it starts to run automatically. Through algorithms to see if there's matches, and every day it's running again to match up crimes. I think it needs to be updated. Some of them are terrible, some of them are pretty good, but just know that there is software in place to do this automatically. Is it a substitute for a good detective? Probably not, but can a good detective know all the crimes that happen within a given vicinity? Of course not. So there are strengths and weaknesses to either approach. I want to distinguish between overkill and, let's say, paraphilic mutilation. Meet Derek Todd Lee and Sean Gillis. Derek Todd Lee and Sean Gillis were both serial killers in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during the 90s and going into the early 21st century. And you could confuse their crimes. I mean, what's the chances? You've got two serial killers operating at the same time. And funnily enough, Derek Todd Lee, who's clearly black, he's targeting mainly white victims, but with the occasional black ones. And Gillis is about half and half. Half of his victims are black, and the other half are white. So the victims, it's not apparently clear based just looking at them who's doing which. But the behaviors say a lot. And one of the mistakes I see is that people will call mutilation overkill. Mutilation isn't overkill. Overkill is when you inflict excessive wounds beyond what you need to kill the victim. So you could stab someone 96 times, and on the 8th time they died. But you decided to inflict, the other 88 wounds just because you were so angry for whatever reason. You had something to get out of your system. That was the signature of Derek Todd Lee, overkill. Gillis, on the other hand, he's a necrophile, okay? He enjoys playing with dead bodies, having sex with them, and cutting them up, meticulously mutilating them in a very cold, precise way. So if you distinguish overkill from mutilation, you can see that, these are two different killers here. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
In the end, it was when I was, say, 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboard began to accumulate that come the summer, it got hot, and I knew it would be a smell problem.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, I'm going to have to deal with the smell problem. And I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion it was the innards, the soft parts of the body, the organs and stuff like that. So on a weekend, I would sort of pull up the floorboards, And I found it totally unpleasant and get blinding drunk so I could face it and start the dissection on the kitchen floor. And I'd go out and be sick outside in the gardens.
What sort of preparation would you have to make for that?
You mean preparation?
Well, I mean, if you were simply to bring these young men's bodies into your kitchen and start to dismember them, that's going to leave an awful mess.
That doesn't leave a mess. Why does it leave a mess?
Well, it could, couldn't it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't leave a mess. You see, when people, in death situations where a knife is involved, there's a lot of blood flying around. I'd love to stab you right now. You can stab me. The heart is pumping away there. There'll be blood splashing all over the place.
Yes.
Funny enough, in a dead body, there's no blood spurts or anything like that. It congeals inside and forms part of the flesh in there and becomes like anything in a butcher's shop. There's little or no blood.
So there's no problem with...
You get a plastic, you know these plastic bags that you have, dustbin liners, you slit one of those so it forms kind of a sheet. You hold the body out front of the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it up.
Right. So he's talking here about chopping up dead bodies, dissecting them, but he says that it's really unpleasant, and he'd have to get blind drunk to do it. He had to just get rid of them because they were starting to smell. Does this sound like MO to you or signature? Well, it's obviously not gratifying for him to do that if it's making him physically ill. And if it's the smell of the bodies rotting that's going, oh, I have got to get rid of these. This is MO. So he's chopping up the bodies for MO, not because it gratifies him, but because he has to get away with the crime. So if somebody dismembers or dissects a body or both, it could be that. Most of the time it is that, actually. In fact, if I've got a statistic right now in my head, 2% of murder victims' bodies are dismembered, but that number leaps to 4% in cases of serial murder. And the reason that happens in serial murder cases is that, unlike Dennis Nilsen, who was a serial murderer here, there are serial killers who are sexually aroused by cutting up their victims' dead bodies. And Dennis Nilsen's American counterpart, Jeffrey Dahmer, he has a very different take on cutting up the bodies of his gay male victims.
Was there something sexual in the dismemberment of the bodies for you?
As time went on, yes, I did get there was a sexual part to that. I started saving the skeletons and preserving other parts, and one thing led to another. It took more and more deviant type behaviors to satisfy my urges, and so it just spiraled out of control.
When it comes to cutting off someone's heads or their appendages, same deal. Here's an example of MO. My good friend Dr. Peter Vronsky has talked to this next offender at great lengths on many occasions.
How did you actually get to cut off their heads and hands?
Very easy, with a hacksaw. That was done only to prevent identification.
These were the only victims that he cut off the heads and hands of with a hacksaw. Long enough, he discovers, well, these were victims he knew extraordinarily well. So in this case, he goes, I can be linked back. That's why in that case, and not in many of the others that he saw. So how do you identify people? Fingerprints, dental. Once again, if we go back to Dahmer, he does it for sexual pleasure. This is a story of the 10th room.
About a 1 foot square box, metal and wood box.
My dad, one week, came to visit and happened to see it, and he was wondering what was in it. He didn't know. Nobody knew.
And I said, Jeff, open it up. I just want to see what's in there.
We got into a bit of an argument because I wouldn't open it up.
And I said, Jeff, open it up, or I'm going to just take it down into the basement and get a screwdriver or something and open it up.
I was thinking I've got to stop this from happening.
He got angry, very visibly agitated.
I thought, you know, it's all going to come crashing down now.
Not fathoming what could be in that box, I said, okay, just open it up tomorrow then, and then let's get rid of it, whatever it is.
What was in the box?
The mummified head and genitals of a young man I met in one of the bars down in Milwaukee. But the box was never opened, not in my dad's presence. And so the lies continued.
So Cunningham, the guy in the previous video, are cutting off the victims' heads, but he's doing it for MO reasons. With Dahmer, it's sexual, his signature. And we see various, kind of 5 broad types of defensive mutilation. This mutilation, you need for about what? Come back in. Okay. DNA. DNA. For the yeah, it's just gonna spawn me back up there, so I'm gonna need the rope down. Okay. You just put the rope back up. Okay.
Sorry, he's on another call.
Pee break.
Use the washroom.
Get some coffee. I want some lemonade. No, my movement control is stuck. What? Here, BRB.
For those of you watching on stream, we're taking about a 5-minute break while Dr. Murder reloads so we can hear him talk. Love you.
I love you too.
Aww. I really liked Yoo-Hoo when I was younger. Now it's hard to find.
Yoo-Hoo?
Yoo-Hoo.
What's Yoo-Hoo?
Oh, Yoo-Hoo. It's like a chocolate. It's like a. It wasn't really chocolate milk. It was just sort of a chocolate water. I don't know. I don't know what it was. It was good. He's back.
Okay, so I was talking for quite a while, and you can hear me.
When did we start losing you? It was probably around. It was right before Santa came on.
Right before who came on?
The guy that looks like Santa Claus.
Oh, okay. Okay, no problem. I'll go back. Did you get the guys before him? You got Dahmer the first time?
Yeah, I think at Dahmer is when you start to cut out.
Okay, gotcha.
How did you actually get to cut off their heads and hands?
Very easy, with a hacksaw. That was done only to prevent identification.
Okay, so that's Richard Cottingham, an offender that my good friend Dr. Peter... Okay, I don't... Okay, what if I'm back here? Is that working?
Yeah, you sound good there. I can hear you.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. So that's Richard Cottingham. My good friend Peter Vronsky has interviewed him probably about a dozen times now, trying to get, inside his head, talk about his crimes. And there he talks about cutting off the head and hands of some of his victims, but he said that was just to prevent identification. And if you think about this would have been back 1979, 1980. It's before DNA. So how do they identify victims? Dental records, fingerprints. You remove the head, the hands, that becomes very difficult to do. So this is what we would call defensive mutilation. It's mutilation for MO. It's not signature-based mutilation. Now, if we listen to Jeffrey Dahmer, you see the same sort of behavior, cutting off a head, cutting off appendages, but done for signature reasons, sexual reasons.
Was there something sexual in the dismemberment of the bodies for you?
As time went on, yes, I did get there was a sexual part to that. I started saving the skeletons, and...
Well, sorry, I was going in the wrong direction. Same deal, but this is head in the box.
About a 1-foot square box, metal and wood box. My dad, one week, came to visit and happened to see it, and he was wondering what was in it. He didn't know. Nobody knew.
And I said, Jeff, open it up. I just want to see what's in there.
We got into a bit of an argument because I wouldn't open it up.
And I said, Jeff, open it up, or I'm going to just take it down into the basement and get a screwdriver or something and open it up.
I was thinking, I've got to stop this from happening.
He got angry, very visibly agitated.
I thought, it's all going to come crashing down now.
Not fathoming what could be in that box, I said, okay, we'll just open it up tomorrow then, and then let's get rid of it, whatever it is.
What was in the box?
The mummified head and genitals of a young man I met in one of the bars down in Milwaukee. But the box was never opened, not in my dad's presence. And so the lies continued.
So as you can see, you have two acts of mutilation in which the head is removed, but vastly different reasons. And there's kind of 5 motives, let's call it that, or reasons for committing acts of mutilation. The most common is defensive mutilation. About 2% of all homicides involve a body being dismembered to be more easily disposed of. It can be making a body smaller to hide it or to transport it. It could be cutting out tattoos that would identify the victim, or cutting off their heads or hands. Or it doesn't gratify the offender. Once again, it's not sexual, but what it does is it's a necessary step to either hide the body or prevent it from being identified. Then there's aggressive mutilation. Aggressive mutilation isn't sexual, but it's born out of anger. It's like when an offender is angry at someone and they start cutting pieces out of their face just in rage. So they're mutilating them because they're infuriated by them. Paraphilic mutilation. This is deviant, violent, sexually driven mutilation, the type that Dahmer was talking about, the type that Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, that manifested that was his signature behavior. That is the type of mutilation that we often see as signature behavior in serial killers. But there's two other types that a lot of criminologists don't ever really consider, but I've written about. What I call expressive transformative. We talked about identity and motive last time. We talked about the Zodiac killer dressing up in the costume. We talked about posing the bodies in the ways that send a message. Well, you can mutilate a body in a way that sends a message. It's not done for sexual kicks. It's not because you're driven by ungovernable rage. You're actually disfiguring it in a symbolic way. And then there's mutilation for commercial purposes. So if we go back to the last talk when I was saying about witch doctors in Africa and how some of them will commit what are known as muti murders, or they'll get someone to commit them for them. They'll pay these people to go out and castrate a living child, a living boy, because they believe that the body parts can then be used in magical spells. The people doing that to that boy are mutilating that boy because the witch doctor's paying him, and then he's using the components of that child in a potion or for a spell, which he is then going to sell to someone. So you can mutilate people in certain contexts for commercial reasons. Think about the classic story of the person who wakes up in a bath full of ice in China and their kidney is missing or something like that, like the organ harvesting. That would be another example. Now I'm going to show you two crime scene photos, and they're probably going to be the worst thing that you see in here. I have, in accordance with the Sansar policies, made sure that none of the private parts are visible, but you are going to see mutilation acts. Now, if that's going to bother you, just don't look, because seriously, they're pretty disturbing. But try and consider it like this. If I was teaching you a biology class, we might be looking inside a body. We might be looking at all kinds of diseases, gross stuff. I'm going to show you these to demonstrate concepts. It's not to shock. It's to show you what one looks like and what the other doesn't look like. So I'm about to put on the first one, so you've got time if you want to look away. And this is an example of paraphilic mutilation. And this was taken in LA in the 1930s. It was the crime scene of a sexually motivated spree killer called Otto John Wilson. This is what he did to a sex worker. And believe it or not, this would have sexually gratified him. Here we go. So she's completely eviscerated, as you can see. Genitals have been mutilated. I blocked those out in accordance with the policies. The nipples have actually been mutilated to block those out, so you can't really see that. But there's stab wounds, there's pieces cut off the breasts, face has been mutilated. I mean, it looks like something that a werewolf would do. And there's been, actually, when you look back to medieval times, there's been arguments made that the activities of serial killers were attributed to werewolves, that people thought, well, there's no way that someone would just do this to an innocent person. And I think you can see why. But actually, it's a sex crime. It can be called mutilophilia or necromutilophilia if it's specifically on a corpse. So this is what a sexually motivated mutilation looks like, as opposed to the Black Dahlia case, famous case in LA. Many of you might already be familiar with this. Well, if you look here, there's been a smile carved into her face. Her body has been completely bisected and posed with the arms over the head. Now, there could be an underlying sexual element to this, but it seems to be more of a communication. What does that mean to carve a smile into someone's face? I mean, we can speculate. Maybe she said something that she thought was funny and he didn't. Maybe she was crying about her life, oh, poor me. And he's just thinking, you know what, I'm sick of hearing it, or I've had a worse life, so now I'm going to make you happy. We can go on and on and on with this, but the point is to cut a smile into someone's face. And this is the wound she died from, actually, is it's symbolic. It's communication. And so I think that this is more of an expressive, transformative, identity-based posing type of crime than a sexual one. Okay, moving on, we're going to conclude just by looking at the crimes of Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to show you how signature can actually change, but it changes in a predictable way. So it's like a river. It's the same river, but different waters run in it. So it changes, but it is the same. And you can track and predict these changes. And we can see this in the Jack the Ripper case. This was from a London newspaper at the time, where they depicted him as kind of like a ghost floating through the night. Now, most people don't include this victim in the series, but I'm inclined to. Normally there's considered to be 5, but I would put money on Martha Tabram, who was killed on August the 6th, 1888, in the George Yard buildings in the early hours of the morning. She was stabbed 39 times. She was a sex worker. I would bet on her being the beginning of the Ripper's victims. Stabbed 39 times, yeah, that's overkill, but where is she stabbed? She's stabbed in sort of her private regions and in a particular pattern. And that would give way to moving on. Keep in mind, this is August the 6th. There's no other crimes really like this at the time. And by August 31st, you have Mary Ann Nichols, who's killed in Bucks Row, also in Whitechapel. Her throat is slashed 2 times, okay? And that's, when you want someone to die quickly, slashing their throat is a pretty textbook way of doing that. I think he wants to just quiet them up, incapacitate them so he can get around to what it is that gets him off sexually. Well, what is that? Ripping. How do we know that that type of behavior gets people off sexually? Because, as we saw before, it did with Otto Wilson in that terrible crime scene photo I showed you. It did with Peter Sutcliffe. So we can, I think, infer that these were sex crimes by the Ripper. So this is Mary Ann Nichols. Yeah, throat is cut 2 times. And then the lower part of her abdomen is partially ripped open by a single deep, jagged wound. And there's some incisions around her abdomen and genital region, but right now it's just cutting. So we've moved from stabbing to cutting to opening up, but nothing's coming out yet. Now, that's August 31st. By September 8th, we have Annie Chapman. Okay, she's found in a doorway in the backyard of 29th Hanbury Street in Spitalfields, which is sort of an adjoining neighborhood to Whitechapel. And once again, throat slashed 2 times. But her abdomen, like Nichols, is slashed, but it is opened right up, and her uterus has been removed. And I think around this point, too, he starts to pull out the intestines of his victims and kind of leave them draped over the body of his victims. So next you're thinking, well, the next one's got to be even more extreme, right? Well, it would have been, but murder is, as I said last lecture, murder doesn't always go according to plan. And so when he gets to September 30th with Liz Stride, there is a single slash across the main artery of the left side of her neck, but no mutilations to the body. Well, why would that be? This can't be the same guy, right? There's no signature. Until you hear that he was interrupted during the act by a passerby. So he was caught in the act. He had to run away. Of course he would have ripped her open. He's a ripper. That's his signature. That's what gets him off sexually. That's what he does. But it didn't go according to plan because he was interrupted. And later on the same night, and this is going to be a graphic photo. The only reason I show you this next one is because it's the only existing photo of the victim. And they didn't have the photography back in the Victorian period to take photographs of people lying on the ground. So they had to stand the corpse up and attach it to a hook in order to take a photograph of it. But this is Catherine Eddowes, and this is later on the same night. Her body is found in Mitre Square. And that's after the coroner or the medical examiner, the police surgeon, has sewed her back up. But you can see here the mutilation is even more advanced. I mean, her throat is severed again. Her abdomen is ripped open by a long, jagged wound. Her kidney's missing. Part of her uterus is missing. Her entrails are pulled out again. And now there's mutilations to the face. He starts to hack away at her face. And throughout this series, too, there's a lot of attacks on the genitals of the victims. And finally, on Friday, November the 9th, 1888, what is considered to be the Ripper's last victim, we can only speculate why. Maybe he was caught for another crime. Maybe he killed himself. Maybe he went insane. Maybe he just moved to another part of the world. But he ends in this. Once again, graphic crime scene photo, but actually it's almost so graphic that you can't really figure out what's going on. He moves on to his final victim, Mary Kelly. It's just a mess, right? It's hardly recognizable as a human being. She's disemboweled. He had a lot of time because he changed the MO here. Okay, he stopped doing it on the streets, and he got her inside her own place at 13 Miller's Court in Spitalfields. Her throat had been severed down to the spine. So even the slashing the throat is getting a lot deeper, more aggressive, more severe. Her entire abdomen is cut open. All the organs are missing, all of them. They never find her heart. Her face is mutilated beyond recognition. Her breasts are cut off and placed on the mantelpiece of her fireplace. That is the last work of Jack the Ripper. So as you can see, his MO is relatively static, but it changes. He's inside, and then he's outside, and then he's inside again. But the signature is, although it gets more extreme, it's always the same thing, this cutting, this opening up, and then pulling out of the insides and making external, taking out body parts, and then facial disfiguration, this ripping, giving rise to the name Jack the Ripper. So this has been today's discussion on MO and signature. I hope that you've found it as fascinating as I always find the topic. Thank you once again for attending. I am Dr. Lee Mellor, and I'll see you on Friday when we start to look at other strange sexual desires in fetishes and paraphilia. And then the last one, probably the most gruesome, but I won't need to use photos as much to demonstrate, will be sexual sadism on Monday, October the 21st. Okay, I'm going to let down the rope and open this up for questions.